Two friends were out walking on an ordinary day. That's how our story begins, but that's not exactly how it ends. If I look out my neighborhood window or my own living room window into my neighborhood, I see countless people walking by every day. We live in an older subdivision where it takes around 20 minutes to walk it. Just enough walking to burn off that extra bite of a dessert you had for your evening supper. Many people walk in our neighborhood, some with dogs. There is the man with the small yappy poodle who lives near the golf course. There is the woman down the street who walks her daughter's dog. Then there are others, numerous walkers that we see nearly every day. There are two middle-aged women who walk in our neighborhood. They have walked that road for years. I don't even think they live in the neighborhood because they often enter down by Shoppers Drug Mart and then walk our subdivision. One of them has lost a lot of weight over the years. I assume it's because of the walking. One thing I notice as I pass in my car and wave, that they love to talk, they love to smile, and they love to laugh. I wonder, how long have they been friends? What are they talking about? I never overhear their conversations. I've never had a chance to ask them if another person has ever been invited to walk with them. I've never had a chance to be in on their conversation. But I have with other walkers. Two of them, our passage tells us, were out for a walk. Them as in disciples or followers of Jesus, who had just experienced what could only be called the worst day of their lives. The other Gospels do not give us as much insight into this story as Luke, because, as Barbara Brown Taylor writes, Luke is the only Gospel writer who tells us the story of what happened on the road. The other Gospels explain the story, much like the one I told you about the two women who walk in our subdivision. But Brown continues, it is the road you walk when your team has lost. Your loved one has died. The long road back to the empty house, the piles of unopened mail, to life as usual, as if life could ever become usual again. It is the road of deep disappointment, and walking, it is the living definition of sad, just like the two disciples in today's story. Jesus, their master, had been the innocent victim of an midnight arrest, an unfair trial, condemned, and then executed. It was a devious plot. Jesus, their master and teacher, was an innocent victim. Just like the child at Young and Finch who we read about, who was killed by a stray bullet. Innocent. And we are as repulsed by the story of Jesus as the young boy at Young and Finch. There's no time to process what has just happened, but on the road among friends, a conversation that lasts between 70 and 105 minutes. If you walk between 4 and 7 miles an hour, that's how long it would take you to walk around 7 miles. They talked, and they talked. Probably enough time for chit-chat, and then more than enough time for meaningful conversation. Our friends then had a lot of time and a lot to talk about. They talked about everything that had happened until they were rudely interrupted. Three's a crowd. That is, unless you're a father who has a teenage daughter and you are chaperoning them on a date. Jesus shows up. And they don't even seem angry when he asks, what are you talking about? Because our response, your response, my response would be, it's none of your business. But maybe they were so saddened, so downcast, as the NIV says, that they didn't even have time or even the heart to respond in such a way. Now, Luke is a great writer, don't get me wrong. He's written a bestseller. I've never written one. But there's one thing I would have done differently if I were writing this story, and I'm not sure if you noticed it or not. But you see, Jesus comes to them, and Luke tells us right away that it's Jesus. He doesn't do what I would have done, to do the Paul Harvey-esque kind of thing, to tell the story about a stranger, and then at the very end say, and it was Jesus. And now you know the rest of the story. No, he tells them right away that it was Jesus who was the stranger. I wonder why, and then it makes me think he couldn't hide it. It was just too obvious. In many ways, this account is as much about the disciples failing to recognize Jesus as it is about Jesus appearing to them in the first place. Had they not been with Jesus for some time? Didn't they know what he looked like, what he sounded like, what he smelled like? Didn't they know his small idiosyncrasies? When Allison was home with her mother trying to coordinate some additional help to deal with her mother's failing memory, it was suggested that Allison do a life storybook. It's a scrapbook, really, about the life of Eileen, her mother. It's for caregivers so that the caregivers don't simply treat Eileen like a number or a client, but that they know her story. So in the process, Allison was going through, she told me, countless albums, trying to find pictures to recall some of those memories. And one of those pictures was of Eileen, Allison's mother, holding Allison in her arms with Ian, her brother, at her side. And her mother kept saying, "That's Ian, but who is the baby I'm holding?" A mother forgetting her child. Disciples forgetting the face of their master. It sounds too unimaginable. Yet both of these stories are true. In fact, they happen every day. In my email blast this week, I asked the question, where did you see God this week? Many of you wrote. I asked this question because in the busyness of our work week, in the busyness of our lives, often, and I don't think it's just me, often many of us just fail to see him. And we need that reminder, especially as we have just come through Easter, and that we are still in the Easter season. You see, we need reminders that we are not alone. Sometimes we just need to know that God is with us. We need those reminders. Now, you may think it doesn't matter, but I beg to differ. Because there are some things that even in Emmaus we cannot escape. We can escape our troubles, writes Frederick Buechner, at least for a while. We can escape the job we did not get or the friends we hurt. We can even escape for a while the awful suspicion that life makes no sense and that faith in Jesus is just a lot of wishful thinking. But the one thing we cannot escape, the one thing it is impossible for you and I to escape, is life itself. The fact that we are here on this earth, living human beings with blood in our veins and breath in our lungs, we cannot escape getting hungry. We cannot escape eating. We cannot escape walking or driving down a dusty road to get to one place from another. And my point is this, says Buechner, that is precisely at such times as these that life is going to ask us questions that we cannot escape for long. Questions about where the road we are traveling is finally going to take us. About whether food is enough to keep us alive, truly alive. About who we are. And who is that stranger behind us? In other words, it is precisely at such times as these that Jesus is apt to come into the very midst of our life, and it's most real and inescapable. Not in a blaze of unearthly light, not in the midst of a sermon, not in the throes of some kind of religious daydream, but here among us. Diane reminded me that she saw God in the nursing home resident who reached out her hand, and in the embrace of her mother, and in the reassurance of her husband for a job well done. A former elder, Irene Preston, still gets the email blast. She wrote, "I've been volunteering at York Central." She wrote, "A woman who I had been praying for had a wonderful confession, if you want to call it that. She was very down and was complaining about a lot of things and didn't have some nice things to say about another patient. And I had talked to God about changing her attitude. And I also mentioned to her that being the Christian that she is, it was not nice to speak those ways about other people. Well, this last Monday, she was so positive in her thinking that I knew God had played a big part in changing her attitude." Jackie wrote, "I saw God in full gear last weekend when he pulled our very troubled family together for a birthday and for Easter." While Melanie wrote about an elderly gentleman who gave her leftover yarn and a case full of knitting needles from his late wife. Melanie says, "I was overcome with the thoughtfulness of this gesture. The more I thought about it, the more I needed to share the tools that I had been given. I have a ton of knitting needles and donated yarn. So this morning I wrote a letter to a local homeless shelter and asked if they would benefit from knitting lessons, yarn and needles provided." Debbie wrote, "I saw God in our check-in time at session. We did something at our session meeting a little different. We asked people to share a little bit about how their week was. And Debbie wrote, we had the chance to really listen and understand more about each other, to get to know the people apart from the business of the church." Amy wrote, "After the third mess, Liam was feeling very frustrated. I was too. And I said to him, 'Liam, if you would just ask for help, this wouldn't happen.' That's when God spoke to my heart. 'Exactly, Amy. If you would just ask for my help in the daily things of life, you wouldn't feel so frustrated, and there wouldn't be so many messes for me to clean up.'" Wow. Message received. And finally, Christina, who's a blogger, wrote me a long story. I'd like to just share just some of it with you. She wrote, "I've noticed a lot of coincidences in brackets in my life recently. I accepted it as things just sort of falling into place for me. But the more I pay attention to what's going on, the more I realize how much God has been trying to reach me lately. On Good Friday, I decided that I wanted to see Marion's drama. I almost didn't go after an exhausting day with a teething baby, but my husband knew I'd enjoy it, so he encouraged me to go. Once I arrived at Kez-Prez, I sat in the back where I normally do. 2 members arrived and sat beside me. They mentioned that it was convenient that there was one more seat beside me because they had invited someone. About 3 minutes later, their friends arrived and a guest had brought a guest. And I saw the couple looking around the church for a place of 4 spots, so I thought I would move instead. It was easier that way. Once I stood up, though, I realized that there was only a few empty seats right at the front. I never liked being so close, not sure why. Guess I like to blend in the background when I can, but God had a different plan, I guess. He wanted me to have a front row seat. The minute Marion began, I felt a calm rush over me. I was completely hypnotized by her performance. And when she sang, I felt weightless. I was so moved by her performance, I could feel God telling me to let go. It was a safe place to let all of my hurt to come out. That he was here to catch my tears and love me through what was happening in my life. So I did. I let go, and I sobbed. I let everything that had been building for so long just fall out of me. Every second I felt lighter, and the more Marion sang, the more tears came down. God wanted me to sit right where I was sitting, where I could see Marion, hear her voice, and let it heal me. He had everything to do with arranging the events to fall together so perfectly, placing me close to him so he could finally break down my wall. I let him in, and I'm never letting him out again. Amen. Sorry. And the disciples' eyes were opened. There's a common denominator in the story between these stories and the biblical story this morning. Just prior to Jesus' arrest and crucifixion, he broke bread with his disciples. And as they gathered together, their eyes were opened. Those two Emmaus travelers didn't recognize that it was Jesus among them. And then they gathered around the table and they broke bread and they drank together, and their eyes, we are told, were open. This is my body broken for you. This is my blood shed for you. This is the God who comes to us and reveals himself to us on the Emmaus road of our lives. The God who reveals himself to us. It happens here today. As bread is broken, as wine is poured out, as God comes to us, as God connects his infinite story with our insignificant stories. As we see and experience together as a church family, convincing proofs Jesus is alive. And as we remember together that yes, 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 we saw God this week. Let us pray.